He was known as the hero who saved the world from the Demon Lord. He was also the one who stained half the world with blood. He was called the Dragon Slayer, Aiden Albiro. But to his regret, he was soon betrayed by his close friends, because as soon as the Demon Lord died, a curse was placed on him. He was furious because his loved ones knew about everything from the very beginning. The young man looked closely at his comrade, and with a grin said that those who want to destroy sin will become it themselves. This is a legend passed down by the Imperial Palace. He looked at the young man intently and said that he simply had no other choice, because the Demon Lord was a true legacy being, and whoever killed him would become the new Demon Lord, and so on. He said with a grin that if he killed him, he would become him, and he thought that was good. He said with a grin to his friend that he should sacrifice himself for this country. His comrades said they simply had no other choice, but they still did not want to ask him for forgiveness. He looked at them with cold rage and hatred, as he was dismayed that they had betrayed him and were not yet going to ask for forgiveness. The young lady looked at him with a smirk and said that he could now rest in peace, while she used her power and summoned a great magical seal. He was shocked because they were his friends. He considered them his faithful comrades. He knew they were his colleagues. But now he saw that it was all a lie. Aiden was drowning in an abyss of hopelessness, and at the same time he understood that it would be better for him to die than to remain forever in such a place. He sank into a slow, pitch darkness. He felt himself being enveloped by an endless spiral downwards. He thought for a long time that this was just an endless fall. But a moment later, he sighed heavily, because he wanted them all to be destroyed. At that very moment, the young people were taken aback, as they did not expect their master to wake up. The young man was puzzled. He did not understand what was happening and where he was, since he saw in front of him the madam, who was bursting into tears, and her husband, who was joyfully shouting that his son had woken up. He was taken aback because he did not understand which son they were talking about and what was going on. At that very moment, the young man stood up and, looking at everyone present, asked who they were. The madam was taken aback by this. She told her son that he had slept for several days, and that was why he was perplexed. At that very moment, she rushed forward and hugged him tightly, and also informed him with a joyful smile that she was his mother and he was her precious son. She said with a joyful smile that his name was Aden Ramez. The young man froze for a moment with bewilderment on his face, since he knew that his name was Tak, but his surname was different. At that very moment he screamed, as his head was bursting with terrible pain. Madame anxiously asked her son at that very moment if he was okay. A few seconds later, his head began to burst with incredible pain, and he was enveloped in darkness. He was a little puzzled, and at the same time scared, because he did not understand what kind of memories had suddenly come flooding back to him. He saw all the memories of a man named Aiden Rems, but at that very moment, he promised, because he realized what year it was today according to the imperial calendar, and if you count, then he went back in time, 15 years before his death. He was sure that he died in the void on the border between worlds when he was abandoned by his companions, but before he could become a demon lord, he was forced to commit suicide. Aiden, in turn, was burning with rage and anger, because he knew that those people who betrayed him must be destroyed. He wanted to find them all and kill them one by one. At that very moment he looked with rage at everyone present in the room and saw fear in their eyes and trembling all over their bodies. From the memories that flooded back to him recently, he learned that the previous owner of this body was a very peculiar person because he never took other people into account. He used young women as it suited him. Now the young man understood that the previous owner was complete trash. He did not understand why he ended up in such a body. He remembered that the young man was very drunk, and therefore, having fallen to the ground, lay there for a very long time, and even managed to get wet in the rain. Aiden knew perfectly well that if he had not been the Duke's son, he would have already been beaten to death. Some time later, he stared into the mirror at his new appearance. He will wonder if he really is Aden Albiro, or if he has just dreamed about it his whole life. At that moment, he was taken aback and wondered why he didn't test his strength now. After a moment, he commanded the system to open. The system is the power that a person receives by eating the heart of a berserker along with his title, Dragon Slayer. After a moment, he was still convinced that it was not a dream. However, he was bothered that his name was broken, but he wondered if it mattered. At that very moment, he laughed with joy because he realized that this was simply a gift from the gods above, because now he could simply find his comrades who betrayed him and take revenge on them. He was very happy about the situation, as he wanted to tear them apart and get even with them. While he was rejoicing, he did not notice a young man who entered the room trembling with fear. Aiden looked closely at the young man and asked if something had happened. The young man was frightened and said in a trembling voice that he had simply brought the gentleman something to drink. Aiden took the cup from his assistant with a smile and thanked him at the same moment. The young man froze in shock, not understanding what his master had just said. He wondered if his master had thanked him. At that very moment, the young man was taken aback and turned pale. He did not know what his master's words of gratitude meant. A moment later, the young gentleman was sipping the excellent drink with a satisfied smile. His assistant was very scared and worried. He wondered if his master liked the drink. At that very moment, he looked intently at the gentleman, who was smiling, looking out the window and wondering whether he had really said words of gratitude to him, and whether they had really been gratuitous. Aiden turned around and, looking at his assistant, asked if he really wanted to say something. At that moment, the young man was taken aback and said that this was not so. A moment later, the young servant came out to his comrade. His friend was a little surprised and at the same time puzzled, as he did not understand how he managed to get out of the room alive, but the young man, trembling with fear, said that the master simply thanked him. Aiden sighed heavily as he realized what had happened. He knew it was just madness. He threw all his thoughts away and immersed himself in memories, as he realized that he had returned many years into the past, but he was disturbed and wondering what happened to his past self. Aiden wanted to know if he existed in the present time separately from him. Aiden knew perfectly well that by this time he should have gained independence from the master, who was the king's former mercenary. He understood perfectly well that he had to find out about everything immediately. At that very moment, he called Philip. The young people were taken aback and froze in shock, as they knew that the gentleman had never called anyone by name before. Aiden smiled and told his assistant that he needed to ask him one question. Philip turned pale and froze in place with horror. After all, in Philip's imagination, his master was completely different, and then he asked with a grin if everything was okay with him. The young man slowly patted his friend on the back and thanked him for everything. Philip was covered in trembling from head to toe. He didn't know what the young gentleman wanted from him at all. He was filled with tears in his soul because he did not understand what was wrong with his master today. A few minutes after their conversation, Philip looked at the gentleman in surprise and asked if he was really interested in the king of mercenaries. Aiden looked closely at his subordinate and asked if he knew about the mercenary king's disciple, as he knew that he had once been a rather famous disciple. At the same moment, Philip said that he heard that there were rumors that the king of mercenaries had disappeared some time ago. Aiden sighed heavily, as he knew about it. At that moment, Philip looked at his master with alarm and called him. He said that he had never heard of the king of mercenaries having an apprentice. Aiden froze in shock and wondered what it meant that he had no students. He didn't understand what he was doing in that place. He didn't understand what the previous him was doing at the same time. At the same time, the man was leisurely wandering through the slums. He glanced sideways at the young man, and at the same moment wondered if he should turn his gaze to the young boy. A moment later, they collided with each other. The young man hurriedly entered the depths of the slums, looking back to see if Kavosta was following him. In turn, he looked with joy at his rich catch. But at that very moment, he did not have time to enjoy his treasures, when suddenly someone unexpectedly approached. The man looked at the young man with a fierce grin and asked if he really had enough courage for something like that. At that moment, the boy was taken aback and froze in place. The mercenary king looked at him with a smirk, as he couldn't understand how he dared to think about stealing his money. He looked intently at the boy, and at that very moment touched his shoulder, and the boy, in turn, shuddered and, stammering, asked the man for forgiveness. The mercenary king looked at the boy with a grin and said that he had a rather large and strong body. At that very moment, he said that the boy would be his disciple. The young man was taken aback, as he had not expected such a thing. But Valkan stood up and, dragging the boy behind him, said that he would teach him to be the best mercenary. This is how he met the master, and from then on, he became famous as the disciple of Master Valkan, and later, after killing the mad dragon, he became known as the Dragon Slayer King. But now he was stunned, as Philip said that he had never heard of the mercenary king having an apprentice. He was taken aback because he realized that his past did not exist in the present. Some time later, the young people were leisurely going about their business, and at the same time they were discussing the young gentleman, since it seemed to them that he had changed, just like the last time Philip had boiled the wine. They knew that the last time Philip had spilled the wine, but the gentleman had not even thrown anything at him. They were surprised by them. At the same time they were puzzled, since the gentleman even thanked them and suddenly began calling everyone by name in a friendly manner. They had heard before that people changed after a serious illness, and looking at the gentleman they thought it was true, but they still wondered if he was okay. But they also saw that he had been looking very listless lately, and it seemed to them that his eyes were empty and sad. At the same time, the young man was busy with tasks, since he really had nothing to do. They cooked food for him, he didn't have to clean. In his free time, he looked for information about his past self. But as expected, there was no other him in this world, but he was still puzzled and wondered about the betrayal he felt earlier. He wondered about the hurt he felt after the betrayal, but more than that, he was interested in his insidious revenge. At that moment, he was taken aback, as he saw the young men who were sparring. He knew that they were the knights of the family. Aiden sighed heavily, for he knew that there were many knights in the duchy who were always busy with something. A moment later, he looked away as he saw his brother, who was wondering what he was doing. Carl looked intently at his brother. Aiden, in turn, looked closely at his brother. He knew that unlike the previous owner of this body, who was a scoundrel, Carl was diligent and had already become a knight, despite the fact that he was the second son and even had the right to succession to the throne. Carl looked at his brother with anger and asked why he was just sitting there instead of drinking as usual. The young man was taken aback, as he saw that Carl did not treat his older brother with much respect. Aiden understood perfectly well that his brother saw him as pathetic, because he spent all day only playing and drinking. He saw the irritation on his face, and he understood perfectly well that his younger brother was superior to him. Aiden sighed heavily and said that he was just bored, and that was why he was looking at the knights. Carl looked at his brother with fury and said that training is not a spectacle, to his brother that if he is not sitting here to train, then he should immediately leave this area. The young man thought about his brother's words for a moment, as he had not picked up a sword for a long time. At that very moment he agreed with his brother. Carl looked at his brother in surprise, as he had not heard what he had just said. Aiden looked at his brother with a satisfied smile and said that he would train. Sometime later he was already at the training ground. The young man bowed and introduced himself, and also greeted the young master before the sparring began. Aiden sighed heavily and looked intently at the young man. At the same time, the other knights were watching them closely. They didn't know if they should stop the sparring, but they assumed that the knight didn't want to be fired, so he would deliberately play along with the young master. Bazan was taken aback and looked nervously at the gentleman, as he understood that this situation was very bad. He could not believe that he would have to fight with such a boor, even though he was a young master. He understood perfectly well that he could not lose to such a weakling. He did not understand who would lose to the neighbor's dogs. The young master looked at the knight with a puzzled look, as he realized that he was clearly deliberately thinking about how to lose, but he wanted to warm up after something like this. He wondered how about teasing the knight a little and giving it his all. At that very moment, he looked at the knight and said that he should not try to lose on purpose. He simply had to do everything in his power, because a knight's apprentice who lost to a weakling was practically useless. Aiden looked at the man with a smirk and said that if he lost, he would have to expel him from the order. The knight was taken aback, as he did not expect to hear anything like that. Everyone present looked at the young gentleman with puzzlement, because they knew that he was a rude man and completely crazy. They knew that he had never held a sword in his hands, and now he wanted to seriously fight the squire. Bazan looked intently at the young man and said that in that case he would start. A moment later they clashed in a fierce battle. Aiden was taken aback, as he felt a furious pain at that very moment. He was puzzled, as he realized that this body was much weaker than he had previously assumed. But at that very moment he looked at his opponent with a grin, because for some reason he wanted to get a few more blows. A moment later he began to attack his opponent first. All the knights present were puzzled. They did not understand what their comrade was doing, since he came out against the young master, and they were worried that the knight could injure the young master, since Togo had no experience in fighting. Bazan looked at the young gentleman with fury. He did not understand how he could fight like that. All the knights present were shocked by this sparring. They were very surprised because they saw that the young gentleman was still holding on. Karl was shocked. He didn't expect to see anything like this from his brother. Bazan was no less shocked by everything that was happening. He did not understand why the young gentleman was still holding on and did not fall after such blows. He was sure that the young master had no chance of winning. He wondered why his sword did not reach the young master and did not cause him any harm. At that very moment, the young gentleman struck his opponent again. He was pleased with these blows, as they refreshed him. With every blow, he felt his blood rushing through his veins. At the same time, the knight looked at the young master in shock. He did not expect anything like this, but the young master dealt blow after blow with delight, as he had not felt anything like this for a very long time. All the knights present were taken aback, as they saw that the young master had pushed their comrade back, and they wondered if they had imagined such a sight. Karl was shocked. He wondered if his rude brother would really prevail over the squire. He could not believe it, because he knew that his brother was a weakling who had previously been bitten by the neighbor's dog. Looking at the sparring data, he noticed that his brother's mastery had changed. It seemed to him that his brother had been holding back his powers all this time. The knight, in turn, was confused. He did not understand how the young master could wield a sword so skillfully. Aiden was a little puzzled, as he had forgotten a lot of things, having lived very lazily for a long time. But he knew that even though this body was weak and lacking muscles, he was the true dragon slayer king who had killed the mad dragon, so he had no intention of giving up. At that very moment, he struck his opponent with fury. The knight was taken aback, as a moment later the blade filled with the power of his opponent was already before his eyes. Aiden looked at his opponent with a satisfied grin and asked if he was really going to give up already. Everyone present was shocked. They could not believe that their comrade lost to the young master. Aiden looked at his brother with a satisfied smile and thanked him, as this sparring was refreshing. Karl was taken aback and puzzledly said that he was glad to hear it. As he left, the young gentleman said with a satisfied smile that he would come to see them more often, as he wanted to test his strength again. He smiled and wished them all good luck. Karl was taken aback by surprise and wondered if his brother was really the same young master he knew. The young knight, standing next to his master, asked himself the same question. Sometime later, Aiden sat in his room and could not believe that this body could not withstand even a simple duel. But nevertheless, he was glad, because he was able to vent his disappointment. He understood that this was a new opportunity for him. He understood that the heavens themselves had given him another chance in this life, so that he could take revenge. But he knew very well that his opponents were very talented, and they could even be called a one-man army, because given their high status, revenge would not be an easy task for him, because he had to take revenge on the King of Knights and the heir to the Grand Duchy of Sayas, Silbet. And also the iron-blooded saint who was chosen by the cult of slaughter, Spicha. His list also included the great magician, Shura, and also the second commander-in-chief of the Immortal Empire, and a great alchemist, Calcis. Aiden was puzzled because he knew that he didn't have a single chance against them now, and that he might have to fight them alone. Aiden understood perfectly well that in order to take revenge, he had to destroy them before they united their forces, because as soon as they united, things would be hard in the country. He had to do all this before a coalition to conquer the dark magicians would be created in 5 years. Aiden understood perfectly well that to do this, he would have to start with Togo in order to try to pump up this body, because in this state, he would not be able to defeat even an ordinary goblin, not to mention his sworn enemies, so he came up with a way that would help him cope with this impossible task. Sometime later, he handed the list to his assistant, and he was stunned. He looked at the gentleman in surprise and asked if he really wanted to buy everything on the list. Philip looked at his master warily and said that he had been very quiet lately, but he did not understand what his master was going to do this time. The young man smiled and asked his subordinate if there was something wrong with the list. Philip, looking at the whole list, said that it listed very expensive ingredients. He was shocked because the list included the herb from troll excrement, the hellflower, the flower of despair, the flowers of sleepwalking, and all the plants on the list were poisonous. The young master sighed heavily because even if he explained to Philip why he needed these ingredients, he would still doubt his judgment, and there was nothing he could do about it. Aiden assumed that the owner of this body had already done something similar. He looked closely at his assistant and said with a grin that knowledge was very dangerous, although it seemed that he was not against this danger. He asked the man he had fixed with a grin if he would play with him if he told him everything. He said it would be a lot of fun. Aiden said with a fierce grin that he was bored because he had been quiet these past few days, so they could remember the good old days. Philip was taken aback and trembled with fear as his whole life flashed before his eyes. At that very moment, he disappeared with the speed of lightning and shouted at last to his master that he had no objections at all and he would buy everything right now. Aiden sighed because he knew that he had to use everything he could in this life, although in his past life he would not have thought about such things. But now that he was the son of a duke who threw money around, it was a completely different matter. He had already experienced the mortal boundary transcendent body as a sword master, so he could reach that same level faster than anyone else. After a month and a half, he still managed to greatly improve his health and body. After a grueling training session, he glanced sideways at his subordinate and asked him to bring him a mana potion. Philip hurriedly approached his master and presented him with the potion. Aiden sighed heavily, but still drank the potion at that very moment. Aiden pushed his body to the limit with training, and then restored it with mana potions. This was the method of breaking it, then healing it. He knew perfectly well that one potion cost about the same as a month of life for a commoner, but the fact that he was the son of a duke made this method possible. At that very moment, he looked at his servant with a predatory grin and asked where the things he had asked for earlier were. Philip was taken aback and said that he had delivered all the things to his room. He really wanted to ask what his master was going to do with all those ingredients. But when he remembered that his master could return to the old days at any moment, his desire quickly disappeared. His interest also completely died down, and he could only resign himself and do whatever his master asked. Sometime later, the young man was looking over all the plants that his faithful servant had given him, and after looking, he noticed that Philip had bought all the poisonous plants on the list. He sighed heavily, as he never thought he would use this method, but he knew perfectly well that he simply had no other choice. He recalled the theory that was created by his former comrades and enemies. He knew that while the poison was wreaking havoc, the body was using everything it could, and in order to desperately survive, the body was revealing its hidden potential. He looked at the poisonous plant with a puzzled expression, as he knew very well that he could easily die from the beautiful-looking flower. But at the same time, he knew that he had already purchased a high-quality holy potion for this, so everything would be fine. He knew that he would survive this experiment, since he had already defeated death once. At that very moment, he gathered his courage and, cursing, ate the poisonous flower. A moment later, he finally drank his elixir, and Isak fell to the ground with a crash, as he felt a very strong and burning pain throughout his body. Aiden was very puzzled, as he knew he would have to do this trick many times. But after a moment, he noticed that his mana flow had definitely become smoother. He sighed heavily as he realized that his comrades, already enemies and from his past life, were right. At that very moment, he heard a voice he had previously known, mockingly asking him if it was fun, but at the same time, he was called the Dragon Slayer King. He was taken aback and froze in place from shock. At that moment, he turned around in anger because he did not understand why he was there. Aiden was furious because he knew he could never forget the voice even if he wanted to. At that very moment, Philip burst into his master's room and asked what had happened. He was taken aback and looked at the young gentleman in surprise. Aiden turned around and told his subordinate to go out. Philip was taken aback and said that he heard a loud noise. Aiden looked at his subordinate with fury and asked if he was really forcing him to repeat those words again. He shouted for the young man to leave the room immediately. Philip was taken aback and, bowing his head, left the room. The young man was burning with anger and fury, as he definitely heard a familiar voice. Aiden understood that this was not a hallucination at all. He was furious because he knew his real name, but he didn't understand why he was there. He laughed wildly and told the young man that he had caught him. At the same moment, he said with a malicious smile that they had not seen each other for a long time, and he called him the Dragon Slayer King, Aiden Albiro. Aiden froze in place in shock, but in turn, the ruler only mocked the young man. Aiden was furious and did not understand why he appeared. He shouted that he had definitely seen his death with his own eyes. The Lord told the young man with a grin that it seemed like he missed him very much. He certainly regretted that he did not have a physical body, and therefore the young man could not look at him. Aiden sighed heavily. He didn't understand how he could talk to him if he had lost his body. At that very moment, he told the young man with a grin that it seemed he had completely forgotten everything, since he died when he became the ruler. Aiden froze in shock, as he did not expect to hear anything like that. He asked the master, puzzled, what he meant. Clenching his fists in rage, the young man asked him if he was now the ruler. At that very moment, he said that it was half true and half not, because at the moment of his death, he transferred his soul into the body of a young man, and initially he planned to take over his flesh and resurrect himself. But at that very moment, the young man said with a grin that his suicide had failed the plan of the powerful overlord. Aiden thought for a moment and asked if he really meant to say that his soul existed within him. The Lord sighed heavily and said that it could be put that way. Aiden immediately asked whether he should kill this soul. He asked if he should infuse holy power into his body. The overlord was taken aback and asked the young man to listen to him, but he wondered if the only way to do this was to die together. The overlord shouted to the king killer that he was not at all the same as he was in the past. The young man asked, puzzled, what he was like now, because in the end, he was still a creature that loved madness and chaos. He sighed heavily and said that the madness and chaos he witnessed was not his in the first place, but was caused by a connection with God, a demon, and fortunately, that connection was severed when the young man found himself trapped in the void. Aiden now understood why he looked calmer than the overlord he had seen back then, because back then he had been just a crazy psycho who couldn't hold a normal conversation. At that very moment, the young man said that he was hearing about the demon god for the first time. The overlord revealed that the demon god, also known as the original sin, was a being of pure evil that was feared even by other gods. He also said that in the past, he was a being cursed to carry out the will of the demon god. Aiden sighed and said that he understood him, but he still asked if this situation was part of his plan. The overlord asked in surprise what situation he was talking about. The young man sighed heavily and said that he had gone back 15 years to take over the body and had taken over the body of Aiden Reams. He wanted to know if this was the work of the overlord. He thought for a moment and said that it was partly his fault. The overlord said that when he entered the young man's body, he tried to use the dragon mana he possessed to turn back time. The young man was taken aback, as he did not know if such a thing was even possible. The overlord informed the young man that dragons were created as agents of the gods, and they could interfere with the laws of the world. Using the power of their dragon mana, they could easily do something like this, and it was not such an impossible task. The young man asked in confusion why he hadn't used it to escape the void back then, but had simply turned back time. He sighed heavily and said that he had simply suddenly felt tired and therefore wanted to rest. The young man was furious and shouted at him not to leave. Another month passed, and the ruler rarely communicated with the young man. At the same time, he trained diligently, no matter what. He was going over the thoughts in his head and developing a plan of further action. But at that very moment, he was taken aback, because he saw that his son could cut up the scarecrow. He realized that this teaching method was definitely effective. He understood that with this technology, stuffed animals would not be enough. At that very moment, he turned his gaze in my direction as he saw the knights. He looked at the young people with a fierce grin as he realized that they were his new training dolls. At that very moment, the ruler told the young man that he was indeed more suited to their side than to the side of the heroes. The young man sighed heavily and told him to shut up. While he was training with his poisonous herbs, he realized that the holy power in the holy potion was causing pain to the Overlord, because he was the source of evil. Aiden opened a small bottle with a fierce grin and told his neighbor to be careful. How at that very moment he turned his gaze in his direction as he saw a familiar person. He seemed very familiar to him, but he couldn't remember where he had seen him. At that very moment, the knight shouted to his subordinate to pay attention as he noticed that he was lagging behind the other apprentice knights. Lo gritted his teeth and told his mentor that he would try harder. At that very moment, the young gentleman was taken aback when he heard the knight's name. He froze as he realized that this simply could not be. He remembered his past life in the Free Knight. He froze for a moment as he saw that the knight was very different from the version in his past life, and he didn't even recognize him. He saw that the young man was pretending to be a knight despite being a mercenary and given the nickname of a free knight, which is why he was here. He knew that the young man certainly had his faults, but he owed his life to him several times. He remembered the battle that took place in his past life. Since then, there were high-ranking mercenaries and a young man with him. Unfortunately, they all died fighting alongside the heroes against the Mad Dragon. Aden looked at the young man with a satisfied smile, since he did not think at all that he would see his face. But now, he finally felt that he had returned to the past. At that very moment, he approached the knights and called them. The commander of the knights hastily asked the young master if something had happened. Aiden looked at Lo with a satisfied smile and called him. The young man was taken aback and asked the master if he really wanted to talk to him. Aiden came closer to the knight and looked at him with fury, and also asked if he should not state his name and rank when a superior addressed him. The young man was taken aback and asked for forgiveness. While he bowed and introduced himself, the master laughed wildly at what he saw. Lu looked at the young master with anger, as he still couldn't concentrate. He didn't understand why the young man suddenly started pestering him and being rude. Aiden looked at the knight with a predatory grin and asked if he had just thought about why the rude man was pestering him. At that moment, the young knight was taken aback and shouted that he had not thought about it at all. He was puzzled and did not understand why the young master was suddenly behaving in such a way. He did not know whether he was going to fire him or kill him on the spot. Aiden broke into a satisfied smile as he was captivated by the sight of the young man writhing in worry. For the first time, he was happy to be in the body of a scoundrel. At that very moment, he looked at the young knight with a predatory grin and said that this was not good, and he should come to him at the training ground in the evening. A moment later, the young master came closer to the knight and quietly whispered something to him. Lo froze in shock and looked at the young man in surprise, but he only looked at him with a smirk one last time. He left with a satisfied smile, leaving the knight with bewilderment on his face. Aiden understood perfectly well that this meeting was fate, and considering his duty to the young knight, he wanted to give him a small gift. Sometime later, evening came, and the young master waited patiently on the training ground for the young knight. He sat quietly and suddenly felt the presence of the knight. At that very moment, the knight, trembling with fear and stuttering, asked the young gentleman how he knew about his secret. But at that very moment, he burst into tears like a little boy and asked the gentleman if he could really heal his hand. In a past life, the young people spent their time together carefree in a tavern. Lo smiled and told his friend Vadim that he continued to think about this even now. A desperate wish that he left unfulfilled in his past life because in the end, he became what he is. The young man intended to repay his last debt. Lo sighed heavily and said that if his right hand were in order, he could live as an ordinary knight. Lu looked at the young master with tears in his eyes and asked if he could really cure his hand. He was well aware of the fact that he had never told anyone about his problem before, but this afternoon he was taken aback and froze in shock when he heard from the young master that his hand was numb. He was shocked because he did not understand how the scoundrel managed to find out about his secret. At that very moment, the young master said that his hand was affected by mana deficiency syndrome. The young man was taken aback, as he knew that this disease refers to all the disorders that occur in the mana channels. Now he understood why his hand was numb, but there was one problem, because this disease was incurable. Aiden sighed heavily and said that people said that the disease was incurable. The knight was taken aback and asked the master if he hadn't said earlier that he could cure her. He understood perfectly well that it was not impossible. They just did not know how to do it, because the cure would only be found many years later. He sighed heavily and said that he knew about the medicine and was ready to cure his hand. The knight looked at the gentleman with surprise and caution, but still asked what he wanted in return. The young gentleman looked at the knight with a predatory and satisfied grin and said that in this world there was nothing that was free, and therefore he had to sign the contract. Lu looked at the small contract with bewilderment, but at the same moment he was taken aback, since he had to spar with the master every day and had to swear that he would do whatever the master ordered. The knight was taken aback and cried out that this was almost a slave contract. The young man smiled and said that it was so, and asked the knight if he didn't like it. He was puzzled and didn't know how he could trust such a scoundrel. Besides, he himself said that this disease was incurable, and now he said that he could cure it. He sighed heavily, as he realized that even if this was the case, he had to seize every opportunity. He told the gentleman with a smile that he simply had no choice, so he would accept this contract. Aiden looked at the young knight with a joyful grin, as he could not imagine that the day would come when he would make him his slave. He felt an exciting moment, as a bonus and as a reward for healing his hand, he intended to take that item as well. He understood that this situation was very dangerous. At that very moment, the ruler said with a grin that the young man should be on their side because he did not look like a hero at all. A few days later, they visited a small place. The knight was a little puzzled and asked the young gentleman if he was sure that this was the same place. Aiden sighed heavily and asked the knight if he really doubted him. At that moment, the knight was taken aback and shouted that this was not the case at all. A few minutes later, the coachman informed the young people that they had arrived at their destination. Aiden slowly stepped out of the carriage and asked his knight to follow him. The young man was scared because he didn't know if there was a way to heal his hand in such a strange place. Moments later, they approached a small but gloomy house. At that moment, they were a little taken aback because they saw a very interesting sign on the door of the pharmacy. Everyone who came was notified that the pharmacy was not a clinic, so they should stop coming, and they did not produce drugs, so drug addicts had to leave. Aiden knew that his comrade Yu had come here in the past to cure his illness, and he assumed that someone else was looking for a cure for mana deficiency syndrome. But unfortunately, nothing came of it. But still, he did not lose hope and entered the building with full confidence. The young man looked around and noticed that there was no one in the building. But at that very moment, he froze and asked the young master what he thought was depicted in this painting. Aiden, looking at the painting, said that it depicted the philosopher's stone and that it was a superstition that magicians and alchemists believed in, an imaginary object that was said to interfere with the god's domain. Some said that it could even bring the dead back to life. He knew that this was an absurd idea, but some even believed it. And considering that he had transcended the divine realms of death and time, this was entirely possible. At that moment, they were taken aback as they heard a menacing voice. Madame was a little surprised, as she knew that few ordinary people knew this story. She noticed that her visitor was very knowledgeable. Aiden sighed heavily and said that he had heard about it. The lady immediately looked at him with a grin and said that she had not had an interesting guest for a long time. She also said that they were not engaged in business. At that very moment, he asked his knight to step out for a moment. Aiden said, "Madam," that they could get straight to the point, and he called her by name. She was surprised that he knew her name. Aiden wasted no time in saying that his knight was currently suffering from mana deficiency syndrome. He knew that she was interested in this disease, and he also mentioned that she was a beast-kind alchemist. She was taken aback, as she did not expect to hear anything like that from an unexpected guest, but at the same moment she asked with a grin how much he knew about her, and she also called him a vile young master. Aiden looked closely at the young lady and said that, like her, his knight also suffered from mana deficiency syndrome. Cassie was taken aback, as she had no idea where he had learned this information about her. He said that he knew that her symptoms were stronger than usual, and without the leaves of this herb, her condition would only worsen. He knew that his knight's condition had stopped on his hand, but with the girl, everything was different. Her illness had affected all her organs, and she was seriously ill. She sighed heavily and told the gentleman that he did not know much, but there was still one thing in which he was wrong. She said it was true that she had been looking for a cure, but until she found a method, she said that meant she could not cure his knight's hand, and she was very sorry. Aiden looked at the young lady and said that if she healed his knight's hand, he promised to protect her and support her research in their territory. She consoled him as he did not listen to her, and at the same time, she said again that she could not heal him. At that very moment, the young man placed a small parchment with information on the table and asked her to read it. She sighed heavily, but still obeyed. But a moment after reading the information, she was taken aback. Aiden calmly looked at the young girl and said that he provided her with medicine for mana loss syndrome. His comrade from his past life had told him about this many times, and so he remembered the recipe, but unfortunately, he did not remember it perfectly. It was for this reason that he was looking for the girl, because she had knowledge, and he needed someone who could understand him even with incomplete information. At that moment, he smiled and asked if it was possible to cure them. At that very moment, she felt a tremor throughout her body, but it was from joy, Cassie. With a smile, told the young master to give her only half a month. She could not believe that there really was such a method. At that very moment, the young gentleman told the girl that with her resources, it would be difficult to obtain the ingredients listed there. She looked at him sharply and said that the fact that he had brought it up meant he wanted something in return. Aiden smiled and said that she should give him a ring. She was taken aback and asked if he really only wanted a ring, which was a woman's ring. She said that it was very ugly of him. He sighed heavily and asked her to stop joking like that, as he already knew the true value of the ring and its purpose. She sighed heavily and said that then he should know how important this ring was to her. It was a ring of speed, and the second reason why he came to her was to get an artifact that increased physical speed several times. It was a very useful item for surprise attacks, escapes during battle. Thanks to this artifact, which Lo received as a keepsake in his past life, even with one arm he was able to achieve a very high rank. Such an artifact would be the only means of protection for a girl with her physical limitations. Aiden looked at the young lady intently and said that he promised to protect her if she came to the Duke's house, because then she would not need such a thing. He looked at her intently and asked what she would say about this agreement. Cassie looked at him sheepishly and said with a smile that she was not against such a thing as long as she could conduct her further research, but she was a little puzzled and asked him if he was sure that he wanted to do such a thing because rumors might start that he had accepted a female human trapper into the Duke's house. He looked at her with a smile and said that he was already known as a noble scoundrel, so people could say whatever they wanted about him, and it didn't bother him at all. She froze for a moment and looked at him in surprise, but after a moment, with a gentle smile, she said that he was still an interesting person. She slowly handed him the ring and asked if he would provide her with food and a room. He smiled and said that he would provide her with many things, but she would still need to earn his trust. After some time, they came to the Duke's mansion. At first he felt awkward, but now he felt at home. At that very moment he was taken aback because he saw Philip, who was running towards him at full speed. He looked at him in surprise and asked if something had happened. Philip was very puzzled and shouted that the matter was very urgent. Aiden looked at his assistant in surprise and asked what was going on, as he was very agitated. At that very moment, Philip shouted that the young master Carl had disappeared on the Mountain of Monsters. Aiden was taken aback, as he did not expect to hear anything like that. Philip said that a few days ago, a message was received that a person had gone missing on the Mountain of Monsters, so the young master got ready and involved an investigation team, and later set out on a journey, but unfortunately, he still hasn't returned. Aiden knew very well that only minor monsters should be found on the Monster Mountain. He looked closely at his subordinate and asked what was wrong with the search party. Philip sighed heavily and said that the search party would soon set off for the mountain. Aiden was puzzled because he understood that if his brother disappeared, he would have to take the place of the heir to the duchy. He was furious because he understood that in this case his plans would be destroyed and his revenge would fail. He understood that he must immediately save his brother. At that moment, he looked at his subordinate and said that he also needed to join the search team, so he should immediately take his girlfriend to her room. Philip was surprised and puzzled by such news. At that very moment, the young man looked at the young lady and said that he had a small request for her. She was surprised and asked what was required of her. At the same time, Philip looked at the girl in surprise, since she was a woman and at the same time a beastman. Sometime later, the Duke met with his son. The Duke looked at his son in surprise and asked if he was really saying that he also wanted to join the search team. The young man looked intently at his father and stated that this was exactly the case. But at that very moment, he received a refusal from his father. He was shocked because he did not understand why his father did not give his permission for something like this. The Duke said that his son and dozens of knights had disappeared at the same time, and this was not a simple missing person case, and he could not send another son to such a dangerous place. At that very moment, the young man burst into tears and said that the dwarf was his brother, and if something happened to him, he would not forgive himself. The Duke was shocked by such a sight. He did not expect anything like that from his son. The young man burst into tears. He understood that if something happened to his brother, his plan for the place would be destroyed forever. At that moment, the demon lord told his comrade that he was a little disgusting, but the young man told him to shut his mouth immediately, as he had no intention of quarreling with him now. The Duke hugged his son tightly with tears in his eyes. He couldn't believe how much he cared about his brother. He sighed heavily and said that he agreed, and he could go on the search, but he had to be careful. The Duke looked sideways at Sir Spire and said that he was counting on him, and he hoped that he would take care of his son, since the man was the only one he could trust. He told the Duke that they would definitely do everything in their power. Sometime later, they all went to the Monster Mountain. The vice-captain looked around carefully and, sighing heavily, reported that the previous search party had been attacked, as their tracks were gradually disappearing. But at that very moment, he noticed a blade that belonged to the goblins. Aiden thought for a moment, as he saw that there were too many strange things. He could not believe that the goblins defeated the knights and his brother. He knew that the low-intellect monsters were erasing their traces, and there was only one explanation for this. He understood that the Goblin King Hobgoblin was involved here, who possessed intelligence and strength on a different level than ordinary goblins. He understood perfectly well that if the Goblin King was involved here, then something like this could be considered possible. At that very moment, he reported his guess to the vice-captain. The man was taken aback, as he knew that even he would not be able to defeat the Goblin King, and therefore they should prepare and then return. Aiden sighed heavily and said that they couldn't afford that, because every minute counted, and if they delayed even a little, they could all be eaten by goblins, so they had to take a search dog with them. The vice-captain looked at the gentleman intently and said that they had already called the search dogs, but it seemed that the scent had completely disappeared, so they had to try something else. Aiden was very angry and shouted at the vice-captain, well, to stop talking and just quickly bring the dog. Moments later, the young gentleman looked at the beautiful dog with a smile. At that very moment, the young gentleman, with a satisfied grin, began to give the dog some kind of potion. Everyone present was shocked, because they did not know what he was doing with the search dog. But after a few minutes, the dog gave a signal. Everyone was surprised, because they did not understand what had happened. Aiden looked at the vice-captain with a satisfied smile and said that he gave the dog a potion to enhance his charm. He was glad that he asked to buy this potion before leaving, because he also knew that in his past life, this potion was useful to him for a search mission. After some time, the dog came onto the trail. Aiden, looking at everyone present, said that it was time for them to go. Sometime later, they finally managed to reach the goblin village. And after a few minutes, they saw the young master Carl and the other knights who were sitting in captivity. The knights were glad since their comrades were still alive. The young gentleman, in turn, was also glad that they were not late. But they clearly understood that something was wrong in this situation. Aiden looked closely and saw several goblins who were also kings. He did not understand how one village could have several leaders. The vice-captain looked at everyone present and said that this was more serious than he thought, but they still had to be prepared and had to give it their all. He said that their opponents were goblins who were kings, and they were not inferior even to worthy knights. At that moment, The vice captain looked at the young gentleman and said that during the battle he must save the hostages and escape with them. The young gentleman agreed with the knight. He was puzzled, as he couldn't believe that there were multiple leaders in this village, but he knew that with so many knights, they could handle them without him. After some time, the vice captain gave a signal to his comrades, and they quickly moved into battle. The goblins were taken aback, as they did not expect an ambush. The knights were furious. They did not understand how the goblins dared to touch their young master. At that very moment, the vice captain shouted that he would immediately destroy everyone, and he rushed at his opponents with a drawn sword. The prisoners were glad that help came to them, as they had not lost hope of salvation. A moment later, the young gentleman burst into the cage and asked all the prisoners if they were okay. Carl was taken aback. He didn't expect to see his brother in such a place. Adeniskosa looked sideways at everyone present and said that the knights would provide support, but they needed to run faster. He understood that he had to leave. At that very moment, Carl, trembling with fear, looked at his brother and said that he must be careful, because there were monsters there. At that very moment, he shouted angrily to his brother that there was a monster behind him. Aiden looked at his brother with bewilderment and casually asked if there was a monster behind him. At that very moment, a very loud rumble thundered. The knights were taken aback as the monster struck the young leader. But the young man managed to jump back, but in turn he was puzzled because he realized that he had omitted something. He could not understand the reason why there were several kings. At that very moment, he realized that in this village there was a monster of a higher rank, namely the most terrible monster among the humanoid demons, the troll. Aiden shouted to his brother to take the villagers and run away first. Carl was in shock. He shouted to his brother that his opponent was none other than a troll, and he could die in the fight. Aiden said with a grin that he knew who his opponent was, but he did not intend to die, since he was still his older brother. Carl looked at his brother in bewilderment, but did not answer. At that very moment, the young gentleman Prinos entered into battle with his opponent. The monster growled and had no intention of retreating. He struck his opponent with fury, but the young man managed to dodge. And at that same moment, he managed to deal his opponent a very serious blow. But to his regret, the young man noticed a moment later that his opponent's wound had healed easily. He was furious because he saw that his regenerative power was enormous, and to his regret, he could not defeat his opponent with his normal power. He understood that this was usually the case, but he had his own trump card. Aiden looked at his opponent with a fierce grin, as he knew that the fight would be quite exciting. At that very moment, the knights became alarmed, as they did not understand what was happening and why the troll was in such a place. Spiel shouted to the young master, as he wanted to deal with the enemy himself. Spiel was very angry, because he understood that the Goblin King was already a difficult opponent, but in front of them was none other than a troll. He hoped that his master would hold out for at least a little while, and then he would rush to his aid. At that very moment, the troll advanced on the young gentleman and did not spare his strength. But the young man easily dodged every blow from his opponent. He had previously asked his new girlfriend to give him the ring just in case, but now he understood that he had to use it. A moment later, he activated the Ring of Swiftness. He understood that in this life he had not reached the same level as in the previous one, but with such a ring, he could deal with his opponent. He dealt blow after blow to his opponent with fury. Aiden did not spare his opponent, and with lightning speed he dealt him blow after blow while he only growled in response. The young master only awakened the fire of anger within his enemy, but after a few seconds, he still overcame the sword aura stage and dealt a crushing blow to his opponent, thus cutting off his head. At that moment, the vice captain of the knights looked around and realized that there were no more enemies on this side, and he shouted that they should help the young master. But moments later, they were taken aback as they saw the young master floating in the air, and behind him blue energy was visible. They were shocked as they understood that such a thing could not be. The knight was shocked as he saw that the young master had entered a stage of sword aura that even he had not been able to master. But after a few seconds, the young master landed himself on a tree. He sighed heavily as his whole body shook with pain. Aiden was puzzled because he had only used the sword aura for a few seconds, and his body did not move on its own. Now he realized that he would have to use the ring with extreme caution, but he realized that the ring was effectively given in battle. The next day, the Duke listened to his subordinate's report and realized that many people had suffered. He sighed heavily, and looking at the knight, said that he must ensure that the families of the dead and injured received the maximum compensation in his power. But at that very moment he looked at the knight in surprise and asked if everything that had happened to his son was true. He was shocked and could not believe that his eldest son had managed to defeat the troll. The vice-captain said that everything was true, and he, along with the rest of the knights, had witnessed a similar spectacle. The Duke was surprised as his son not only used the sword's aura, but also managed to defeat the troll. He couldn't believe that this was the son he knew. That same night, the young gentleman sat quietly in his room and surrounded himself with an aura. He realized that even if it was just for a moment, he was still using the sword aura on his sword, and then he felt his mana reserves increase. But this time he realized something else, because he was very weak. He was furious, because he understood that he needed to become stronger as soon as possible so that he could crush his opponents. At that very moment, the Demon Lord told the young man with a grin that he really liked his determination. Aiden was taken aback, as he did not understand where he came from. The Demon Lord looked at the young man with a grin and said that he was that very lord. But at that very moment, the young man could not bear it, and burst into wild laughter. Since the Lord's appearance was very sweet, the Lord of the Demons was furious and shouted at the young man not to laugh. But the young man could not resist and burst into wild laughter. He could not contain his emotions, as the sight of the formidable Demon Lord simply made him laugh. The ruler was furious and shouted at the young man that it was all his fault, because it was all because he was very weak. Aiden laughed and asked the master how he had performed. The Lord told the young man that only he could see him, because they were one, and as soon as he became stronger, he was able to show himself. Aiden asked in bewilderment if he could really see him now, since he didn't like all of this. The Lord looked at the young man in surprise and asked if it wasn't rude towards his savior. Aiden said to the Overlord that he had previously told him that the Overlord was a curse passed down by the demon god, and he was freed from this curse because the connection with the demon god was severed. Based on this, he wanted to know what his real name was. The Lord sighed heavily and said sadly that, unfortunately, he had long since lost his name, and so he simply existed now. Aiden looked at him intently and said that from now on his name would be a curse. He looked at him in bewilderment, since the name was not very suitable. Aiden said that it was all true, since he was a curse placed on him, and accordingly his name would be a curse. The Lord sighed heavily and said that it was stupid. Aiden sighed heavily and casually told the Lord to shut his mouth, but he said it was not in a very nice way, and later called him a curse again. A week later, the young gentleman came to his new girlfriend. Entering the room, he asked with a smile if the treatment was going well. She smiled and asked if he had really come to visit, and at the same time she called him Mr. Troll. Aiden was puzzled, since they called him the Troll Lord because he killed a troll, but he knew she meant that he looked like a troll. He didn't like it because of that. At that very moment he smiled and asked where his knight was. She said with a smile that he was inside. A moment later, the young gentleman walked into my room where his knight was. Lo turned and looked at his master, but he was in tears. He cried with happiness because he saw that his hand was moving, but at the same time he was shaking. He said that his hand was back to normal. At that very moment he fell on his knees before the young master. Bursting into tears and trembling, he thanked the young master for recognizing his illness and being able to cure him. He looked at the master intently and said that although he was only an insignificant being, he could swear on his life that he would dedicate his existence to the master. Aiden looked at the knight with a satisfied grin, because he knew that everything was right, and from that moment on, he would work for him like a slave. He said with a joyful grin that he would gladly accept his oath of allegiance. Aiden looked at his new friend and asked if she hadn't been treated. She looked at the gentleman with a smile and said that his mana deficiency syndrome was a bit unusual, so she needed to study a lot of things. He looked at her with a smile and said that he understood everything, and also praised her for her good work. She smiled and said that her food was good, that she should thank him, since it was all because he told her about the new method. At this, she again called him the Troll Master. The young master was a little puzzled by such a nickname, and his faithful knight could hardly contain his laughter. At that very moment he shouted to his knight that he was completely healed and must now leave immediately, as they had a lot of work to do. Lo looked at the gentleman with a joyful smile and shouted that he would now carry out any of his tasks. Some time later, the young knight was burning with anger. He could not believe that physical labor was his first task. Some time later, the man greeted the young master with a joyful smile. He looked with admiration at the troll that the young gentleman had caught. He admired its condition and understood that the troll would sell well, because such a product was very rare. Aiden told the man that he would like to use the proceeds from the sale of the troll to buy the goods in question. At the same moment, he handed the man a package with the names of the goods and asked if such a thing was possible. The man smiled and said that of course everything was possible since their trading group had all the goods, but at that very moment he was taken aback, because he saw that the list did not include herbs at all, but poisonous plants. Aiden looked at the man with a fierce grin and said that if he had told him earlier that this was a herb, then there were only herbs on the list. He asked the man if it was possible to purchase this product. The man was taken aback, not knowing what to answer. But at that very moment he shouted that there were only herbs on the list. He understood that if he ran into the young gentleman, he might not return home alive. Some time later, the young Master Cheese returned home with a joyful smile. He knew that easy money is always good. At that very moment, the curse told his master that the mercenary habit in him had not changed. After some time, Philip met the young gentleman. Looking at the gentleman, Philip said that the Duke was looking for him. The young gentleman was surprised, as he did not expect such a thing. Some time later, he quietly entered his father's office and asked if he had called him. But after a few minutes, the young gentleman was taken aback, as he saw an unexpected guest. He was shocked and did not understand what the man was doing in the Duke's residence. The man looked at the young man with a smile and said that, judging by his appearance, it looked like the rumors that he had killed the troll were true. He said with a smile that he was very pleased to meet such a hero. Aiden was puzzled because he met a man from his past life who did not treat him very well. He did not have any pleasant memories of the man at all. He knew that in his past life, the man was just an old man who looked down on the mercenaries. He sighed heavily and said that he was very pleased to meet the man, and he also introduced himself. At that very moment he greeted the defender of the northeastern border, Margrave Tirida Sedusa. The Margrave was surprised that the young man knew about him. Aiden sighed heavily and said that he, of course, knew about the Margrave. He looked at the man intently, as he was one of the few in the Empire who had reached the stage of a swordmaster. Swordmaster, the transcendental level that everyone dreams of in a knight. Those who surpassed talent and entered the superhuman stage could cut through mountains with their swords. In this, they made the air tremble with their breath. He had been one of them in the past, and so he understood that this was a stage he must reach again. At that moment, the Margrave looked at the Duke with a satisfied smile and said that his son was very polite, contrary to rumors. He noted that the man raised a wonderful son. The Duke smiled and said that his son still had a lot to learn. Fried looked at his comrade and asked if he could just leave his territory, since he heard that the territory had recently been attacked by orcs. He sighed heavily and said that it was not only their territory, but suspicious movements were also detected in the Slaughter Tower in the Death Wasteland, controlled by the Slaughter Cult. At that very moment, the young gentleman looked angrily at everyone present, as he remembered the cult of Slaughter, because he also had his own affairs there, since one of the traitors from his past life was an Iron Blood Saint. The Margrave looked at his friend and said that the usual movements of monsters were happening in several different places at the same time. He asked the Duke what he thought was a coincidence or not. Fried thought for a moment and said that since he mentioned it, it really seemed very strange. At the same moment, the Margrave said that for this reason, they were thinking of creating an investigation team. He asked the Duke if he would help them. A moment later, the Margrave approached the young gentleman and asked with a smile if he would like to join his knightly order. The Duke was shocked, and the young gentleman was taken aback with surprise. Tyrid looked closely at the young man and said that he had heard a lot about him, and that he had managed to reach the Sword Aura stage in less than half a year of swordsmanship. He said he thought it was all nonsense, but now he was personally convinced of these rumors. Tirid looked at the young man with a fierce grin and said that he would make him the greatest swordsman on the Western continent. At that very moment he swore on his name, but the Duke asked him to stop. The Margrave looked at his comrade with a smile and said that he did not need to worry since he would take care of his son. He looked closely at the young man and asked what he would say, since the choice was his. At that very moment, the young gentleman looked at the man with a smile and said that he really appreciated his offer, but he had to refuse. The man was taken aback since he did not expect such a thing. At that very moment, he looked at the young man and asked if he understood what it meant to join the Order of the Knights of Cetus. Aiden sighed heavily and said that he understood everything, because it was one of the most famous knightly orders in the Empire. He washed himself and said that he was confident that he could become a swordmaster on his own. He knew very well that this was possible, because he had already passed this stage in the past, so achieving it again was only a matter of time. Aiden looked at the Margrave intently and said with a grin that if he were to fight him now, he could at least scratch him once. The Margrave froze in place with rage. At that moment he looked closely at the young man and laughed, as he was not sure that he could do something like that. The Duke trembled with fear, as his son had angered his comrade. The Margrave angrily told the young man that he was incredibly rude. But at that very moment he burst out laughing wildly, as he noticed that the young man was really a funny guy. Aiden. At that moment, he sensed the Margrave's ability, as he could make even the air tremble with his murderous aura. He immediately applied the skill of fear. The man looked at the young man in surprise, as he couldn't even believe that the boy was holding up against the mastery of fear. He looked at him intently and asked with a smirk if he was sure that he could stand by his words. Aiden, with a fierce grin, said that he was sure, and also asked the Margrave if he wanted to, that is, make a bet with him. Aiden knew very well that the old man always had a weakness for betting. He smiled and said that if he could not make a single scratch on the Margrave, he would join his knightly order. But at that very moment, he looked intently at the man and said that if he won, he should give him his sword. The man froze in shock. He was puzzled by such a bet. He simply could not believe that the young man was eager to get his family heirloom. He looked closely at his old friend and said with a sneer that his son was not like him. The young man exhaled heavily, as he was glad that he managed to survive. At that very moment, the Margrave looked intently at his old friend, for he saw that he could not bear the mastery of fear, and fainted. He looked at the young gentleman with a grin and said that he would certainly accept his bet. At that moment, the Demon Lord said that it seemed like the young man had his sights set on the sword from the very beginning. The soapy response said that he should get a similar sword if he was given such an opportunity. He saw one of the legendary Beelzebub swords in front of him. At that moment, the Demon Lord told his master with a grin that he was indeed on their side. Sometime later, the knights prepared for the duel. Aiden looked at his opponent with a smirk and asked if he really planned to use the Ogre Slayer's sword against the goblin. At that very moment, the Margrave said with a grin that he did not know who the young man really was, a goblin or an org, and no matter who the enemy was, a knight's duty was to give it his all. Each man was furious, for his opponent had again used the trait of chivalrous politeness, which he knew had never changed, whether past or present. He knew that the duel had several conditions, namely that they were not allowed to use the aura blade, and the Margrave would not move his right leg. At first glance, this might seem unfair, but for the swordmaster, this was not even a hindrance. He understood that if he thoughtlessly rushed at him, he would be immediately knocked out. At that very moment, the Margrave turned around, as he saw that they had quite a lot of spectators, but he still told his opponent that they should begin. The young man looked at his opponent with a grin and agreed with him. At that very moment, the Margrave was taken aback, as he saw that the young man had gone on the offensive. He was surprised, but in turn he managed to block his opponent's blow with ease. At that very moment, he looked at the young man with a grin and asked if he had really started throwing himself at his neck from the very beginning. He noticed that the young man had been in a real fight. Aiden looked at the man with a smirk and said that he knew he would block such a blow, as he expected his opponent to easily block the blows. But he had no intention of giving up, and at that very moment he rushed towards his opponent, as he wanted to deal with him and find his weak spot. The Margrave was surprised, as the young man used an unusual fencing style in battle. A moment later, he realized that this style of fencing was preferred by incompetent mercenaries. He forgot how he looked at the young man and said that if he joined their knightly order, they would have to fix it. At that moment, the demon lord snorted, as he raised what kind of relationship they had now. Aiden was burning with rage, as the old man began to insult him again. But despite such insults, he was not going to give up, and at that very moment, he rushed towards his opponent, as he wanted to see how he would deal with the incompetent fencing master. The young man again dealt blow after blow to his opponent. The Margrave was puzzled by such pressure. But the young man was not going to give up. He applied the skill of the king of mercenaries every time. The man looked at his opponent with a fierce grin and said that he was not going to lose to such a simpleton. But at that very moment he was taken aback, as his young opponent used a knightly charge. The Margrave was shocked. He did not understand what had happened. Aiden only looked at his opponent with a fierce grin, preparing to deal him a crushing blow. Everyone present was shocked. They couldn't believe that their young master was moving forward with ease, but now they were convinced that the rumors that he had defeated the troll were not a lie. The Duke looked closely at his son. He realized that the Margrave, despite his fatigue, was a master of the sword. He did not know if his son could cope with his friend. But the Margrave only looked at the young man with anger, since he had no intention of losing to him. But moments later he was taken aback as another hail of enemy attacks rained down on him. He was a little puzzled, as he did not understand what kind of strange technique the young man was using. He saw that he was striking randomly, but he was aiming for the vital ones. He was shocked, but at the same time glad, because he understood that this was simply incomprehensible, and he really had to take the young man under his control in the future. Aiden was taken aback when his opponent blocked the shot. But at that very moment the Margrave struck the young man, but the youth managed to dodge. Aiden was furious as his opponent simply swung his sword. The demon lord told his comrade that if he tried to block the blow, he would simply be cut in half. Aiden, in turn, easily bounced off his opponent. The man looked at the young man with a fierce grin and said that he had an interesting sword technique, but if that was all he had, he would not be able to defeat him in a fight. Aiden, breathing heavily, looked closely at the man and said that he was still standing on his feet. Tirids immediately laughed wildly and told the young man that he had never disappointed him, and that his eyes seemed just as sharp. Tirid looked at the young man with a grin and greeted him in advance in the knightly order. At that very moment, the young gentleman thanked the Margrave in advance with a fierce grin on his face, and at that very moment he stood at attention, since he did not intend to follow the Margrave's designated path. But a moment later the young man, with his ease, disappeared from his opponent's field of vision. Tirid froze for a moment in shock, as he did not understand where his opponent had suddenly disappeared to. He didn't understand how the young man could move at such speed. At that very moment, he realized that his opponent was hiding his true skills. He was shocked because the young man easily inflicted a very strong cut on him, and he did not even notice it. He was angry with himself, as he realized that he had been deceived. After the blow, Aiden looked at his opponent with a smirk and said that he would handle his weapon well. Everyone looked at them intently and in surprise, as they did not understand what had happened at all. The spectators wondered if it was really all over. At that very moment they exploded with joy and began to praise their master. The Duke was shocked. He did not expect anything like this from his son. A moment later, everyone started chanting their master's name. They were glad that he had won, because they believed in him. After the victory, the demon lord asked the young master if he was worried about using the ring. He also noted that the young man was more suited to the underworld than a hero. Aiden did not understand why his comrade was so nervous, but the lord still insisted that the young man was just a cheater. The Margrave approached the young man with a smile and said that he had not disappointed him, because he had managed to lure him into a trap, and at the same time he had hidden his skills. Aiden said with a smile that it was just luck. Aiden looked at his opponent in bewilderment, as he thought the man would lose his arm, but he only gave him a light scratch. At that very moment the man handed the sword to the young man. Aiden bowed and thanked his opponent, and said that he would handle him with care. In turn, he could barely contain his emotions, since he knew that he had received the real treasure. The Lord sighed heavily and told the young man that he was not a hero, but a crook. Sometime later, the young man stared at the legendary sword. At that moment, he looked closely at the demon lord and asked what had happened to him, since he had previously called him a crook. The Lord looked at the young man with a grin and said that he still did not know how to use this sword correctly, and he knew the secret of the legendary swords, which people did not know about. Aiden was shocked by this. He wanted to know if it was a secret or a curse. The demon lord laughed and told the young man that he would not tell it for free, but if he swears to serve him and never force him to drink the holy potion, he will tell everything. A moment later, the young man turned around and looked at the demon lord with a smirk. As he had already managed to make a blood pact, the lord was furious, as he had just been tricked. Aiden looked at him with a smirk and asked if his subordinates didn't wield dark swords. He asked the demon lord if he thought he didn't know about it. Beelzebub is one of the legendary swords. On the outside, they looked like simple blades that were durable, but in reality, they were created from the bodies of the corrupt lords who once ruled the ancient underworld. Only much later did it turn out that these swords were cursed, and each sword contained the power of a different corrupt lord. There were several conditions to awaken the sword's hidden power, including a person pouring blood into the sword and making a blood pact. The demon lord was furious, as he knew that for the first time he could be the victor. Aiden asked with a smirk why he should serve the lord as he was already dead. He also told the lord to get ready, as he would be drinking the holy potion. The next day, the young man met his father. The Duke sighed heavily and asked his son if he really meant to say that he wanted to join the Margrave's search party. The young man smiled and said that it was true. At that moment, the Duke looked at his son with excitement and said that he knew that he was very strong, but this search was very dangerous, and this place was incomparable with the mountain of monsters, so it was difficult for him to give his permission for such a thing. Aiden, with sadness and sorrow in his voice, told his father that he intended to go on campaign with the great Margrave. He hesitated, not knowing how to persuade his father, but at that very moment he laughed at the Margrave and told his friend not to worry, as they would be together and he would look after the young man. The Margrave told his friend with a smile that he would ensure his son's safety no matter what the cost. At that very moment the Duke sighed heavily and told his son that this was not a picnic at all. Aiden smiled and said that he knew about it and understood everything, but he also asked if this investigation was not for the safety of their territory, because if so, he also really wanted to go. The Margrave looked at his comrade with a smile and said that he must let his son go. The Duke was puzzled, as he knew that he could not just let his son go. Aiden looked at everyone present with a fierce grin, because he knew that in his past life he was useless, but this time he wanted to prove his worth to everyone. At that moment, the demon lord said that the young man was not going for the Duke, but for the sword awakening. The next condition for awakening the sword is to absorb a huge amount of life force into it. He wanted to defeat monsters and obtain life force. Aiden was very serious, as he wanted to deal with all the monsters in his path. At that moment, the demon lord sighed heavily and said that for the first time he felt sorry for some pathetic monsters. At the same time, there was chaos in the Pirin Mountains. The monsters ran away in fear as they sensed the approaching danger. Sometime later, the research team arrived at the site. Aiden looked in surprise at the beautiful fortress that was built to protect against the demonic beasts of the Data Mountains, but he did not know if this was really true. Aiden looked around and realized that the room and the soldiers were in complete disarray, and in such a situation, they would not be able to cope even with the goblin horde. He did not understand how they intended to hold back the attacks of the monsters. A moment later, the chief officer of the fortress greeted them. The man looked at them with a smile and introduced himself. He said that he was the chief officer of the fortress, Dasvalt Timon. Dasvalt Timon looked intently at the Margrave and at the same moment looked at the young master with a grin, while calling him the Master of Trolls. At the same time, the knights mocked the young man, because they saw a rude person in front of them. But they also said that he was a great troll lord, but they did not believe that he was able to crush the troll. Lo couldn't stand it and looked at them with anger. He wanted to deal with them right away, but the young master told his loyal raider to calm down and not pay attention to them. The demon lord was puzzled. He did not understand how his master could be calm in such a situation, but he knew that a fight would not lead to anything good because he had heard this many times, and he was no longer angry. At that very moment, the Margrave looked away with an angry expression as he noticed that there was fresh air around them, but for some reason, many beetles were flying around, making a lot of noise. At that very moment, he looked at the knight of the fortress with a menacing gaze, and he trembled with fear. The knights were taken aback and looked away from the newcomers. After some time, they were walking around the outskirts of the fortress. Dasvaltiman said with a smile that he heard the news that there were monster attacks in every territory. Aiden, looking at the man, he asked if something similar had happened in the vicinity of the fortress. The man smiled and said that there was no need to worry about their strength. The Margrave looked at the man in surprise and asked if there were monsters living right in front of the fortress, which meant there was no danger. The man smiled and said that there was no danger. At that very moment, he said with a smile on his face that the orcs had settled in the center of the mountain range, and perhaps it was because of the orcs that the monsters did not descend into their territory. The young man was surprised that the monsters kept other monsters at a distance. He understood that this was nonsense. At that very moment, he was taken aback as the demon lord called him. He told his master that something great was coming. The young man was a little puzzled, as he could not see anything. But looking back, he saw something, and at that very moment he informed the Viscount that the monsters were approaching and they had to close the gates. The Viscount looked at him in bewilderment, as he did not understand what the young gentleman was talking about. He smiled and told the young gentleman that his jokes had gone too far, since there was nowhere for the monster to appear. But at that very moment the Margrave told the Viscount to close the gates immediately. The Viscount looked at the Margrave in surprise, as he did not expect him to fall for such tricks. But a few minutes later, he heard a terrible noise and rumble. The Margrave immediately reported that they had sensed a wave of monsters. At the same time, monsters were approaching the fortress in a terrible stream. The knights of the fortress were shocked and frightened. They did not understand what was happening at all. They screamed and called for the Viscount, because they did not know what to do. The Viscount was taken aback, not knowing what to answer his subordinates. At that very moment, the Margrave shouted angrily and asked what they were waiting for. He shouted for them to close the gates immediately. The knights were taken aback, but obeyed the order. They closed the gates in a hurry and trembled with fear when they saw the monster approaching them. But after a few minutes, one monster still managed to slip through the gap in the gate. He did not waste time, and at that very moment, he attacked the knight. The knight was shocked, he screamed, as the pain from the fangs and the monster was unbearable. But a moment later, the young master easily dealt with the monster. At that very second, the monster's lifeless body fell to the ground with a crash. Aiden looked closely at his new sword, as he knew that this was not enough. But nevertheless, he noticed that the sword was sucking out life energy quite well. The young knights looked at each other in surprise. They couldn't believe that the young master had just used the sword's aura. At that moment, they thought that the rumors about the troll master were true after all. At that moment, the demon lord burst out laughing. As the young man was again called the troll master, Aiden was very angry. A moment later, the young knight thanked the master for saving him. Aiden was embarrassed by this and shouted at the knight that instead of thanking him, he should grab his weapon and defend the wall, and the same applied to everyone else. Lu rushed to his master with lightning speed. He was worried about his mother and wanted to know if he was okay. Aiden sighed heavily and told his knight to look into the distance. The young knight was taken aback when he saw such a sight. He could not believe what he saw, as this was the first time he had seen such a huge number of monsters. Aiden looked at the monsters with a fierce grin, as he knew that from now on they would be his daily snack. The young man looked at the young master with bewilderment, as he did not understand what he was talking about. Aiden looked at his new sword with a fierce grin and asked if he wanted to eat them. Aiden was taken aback after a moment and wondered what he was even saying, since he hadn't expected anything like that from himself. At that very moment, he heard the demon lord's wild laughter as he claimed that the young man simply couldn't help himself from doing something like that. He said that his sword was the sword of gluttony. He drew out the gluttonous instincts of his owner. The demon lord told the young man that he really enjoyed listening to his true feelings. At that moment, the young man was taken aback, as he realized that he needed to be more careful. Aiden understood that since he was in such a place, he could awaken his sword. He wanted to gratefully absorb all the life energy in his path. At that very moment, he saw the Margrave, who, with a satisfied smile, told him that he would soon return after cleaning. Aiden shouted at the Margrave that he should stop, as he wanted to deal with the monsters himself. He shouted and asked the man to stop, but all his attempts were unsuccessful, as the man easily pushed off the ground and rushed into the heights. Aiden was shocked by the old man's behavior, but he could not do anything. At the same time, the Margrave looked at all his opponents with a fierce grin. He wanted to kill them all at once. At that moment, the knights were taken aback. As they saw the blade of aura, they knew that only a sword master could use something like that. Aiden was shocked by what was happening. He shouted at the Margrave to leave him at least half of the monsters. But the man, with a fierce grin, dealt blow after blow, sparing no monster in his path. After some time, they could only see the corpses of the monsters. A moment after the battle, Tirid laughed, as he had not used his power properly for a long time, and now he was raising that releasing power was very wonderful. At the same moment, the young master, with tears in his eyes, wondered why he had come to this territory at all. The Viscount looked at the men with a smile and thanked them, since thanks to them they had escaped without much damage. A minute later, the young master heard the voice of the demon lord and thought that he had come to mock him again. At that moment, the demon lord said that a wave of monsters was just approaching. The young man was a little puzzled and did not understand what the lord was saying. The lord said that the grandiose thing he spoke of was not a wave of monsters. Aiden was a little puzzled and wondered if it wasn't a wave of monsters, then what was it?